What's up guys, it's Brad from Light Architect here. Today we have a very exciting tutorial on using chaos with the new Mantaflow branch in Blender 2.82. Mantaflow has replaced the older L-Beam fluid simulator inside of Blender 2.82. So if you downloaded the latest version of Blender, this tutorial is for you. Mantaflow has some of its own unique qualities that are different from L-Beam, but overall it's a really great improvement that allows you to create some really awesome explosions much easier inside of Blender 3D. Anyways guys, here is the final result we will be making today. It's similar to our last mini-nuke tutorial that we did for Blender 2.81. The concepts of creating explosions inside of Blender for Mantaflow remain the same, but the smoke domain and the way the fluid interacts is a little bit different, so you just have to get used to the way it simulates. Anyways, we are going to create a mini-nuke explosion like this inside of Blender utilizing the Chaos add-on for 2.82. Let's get started. Alright, so first let's go ahead and open up Blender. Alright, so the first thing we are going to do is just delete everything in our scene here. Let's make sure that the Cycles rendering engine is selected over here. And now we will go ahead and add a ground plane for our smoke to interact with. So we'll go over here to the Chaos tab here, and just like the last tutorial, we're going to go here to our collision cube operator. And the reason we're using this collision cube operator instead of a normal cube is because when we click this inside of the Chaos add-on, it's going to create collision and fluid properties automatically for this object. So in other words, this object is going to interact with your smoke and your particles automatically. And of course you can do that through the physics properties tab if you want to just add your own cube and add your own properties. That's totally fine too, but this is just one of the reasons we've created this button, is to make that easier for you. So let's just scale this down and kind of make a little ground for our scene here, something like this. Maybe we'll scale it up a little bit. We just want to create a little layer like this. Okay, so now let's go ahead and create the particle systems in our mini-nuke explosion. So let's go up to our chaos options here, and we're going to use the dynamic smoke fire option here. So let's go ahead and click that, and then we will go here to our particle parameters. Before we add anything to our scene, we're going to change a few settings. We'll go to the start size will be the 1.5 instead. There are a lot of settings you can tweak for an interesting result, and of course you can also change your particle settings after they're added to your scene, but we've kind of found some good settings to start out with. This is pretty good, I think. Yeah, so we'll just change the particle start size to 1.5. Everything else will be at 1, except for the smoke velocity parameters. We'll have that at 0.25 and 0.25 for the start and end velocity of our smoke. And you can play around with this. They give some very interesting results, especially when you start playing with the velocity parameters. But yeah, let's continue. So our explosion is going to be comprised of 3 360 ground burst operators. One of them will be an upward particle blast. The second one will be particles blasting out along the ground. And the third one will be kind of a mixture in between to kind of fill in the gaps of smoke that the first two kind of leave out. So let's go ahead and create this first 360 ground burst. So we'll go ahead and select the frame we want our explosion to start on. So probably around, we'll try frame 20. And then we'll make sure our 3D cursor is where we want the explosion to be, and then we'll press the 360 ground burst operator. And now as you can see, a smoke domain for your explosion as well as the 360 ground burst operator has come into our scene here. Let's go ahead and position our smoke domain around our explosion. We'll probably scale it up a bit too. The main thing for the smoke domain is that you want it to contain your explosion but not be too close to the edges, because if it comes too close to the edges, it's going to interact with it in a negative way. So let's go ahead and select our 360 ground burst operator here. And the cool thing about the 360 ground burst operator, as you've probably seen in our previous videos, is that you can scale it on the z-axis to create different looks for your particles. So for example, we scale it up like this, it blasts upward, right? But if we scale it down along the z-axis, you can flatten it entirely and create kind of that dust wave style effect. And we probably need to add some more particles for this specific example. But yeah, the first particle system we're going to add is our upward blast. So we'll go ahead and scale this up on the z-axis quite a bit here. We'll just position this. We'll just position it right above our ground plane here. You can play around with the scaling as well. And we need to add a little bit more particles to our simulation here. While our 360 ground burst is selected, we'll go to the particle settings here, and we'll change this number to something like 2000. And we'll also change the lifetime of our particles to 5. Essentially, the longer the lifetime of your particles, of course, the longer they're going to live, and the longer the lifetime, it feels like the explosion is bigger in scale. So if I wanted to make this explosion feel even bigger in scale, then I might increase the lifetime of those particles even more. But yeah, let's try this. This is a pretty cool looking fuel blast here. That's pretty cool. We might change the lifetime randomness a bit so that they die off in a random way. Alright, so that's our first upward blast here, and we could actually just go ahead and make that and turn that into an explosion, but we want to create also that dust wave on the bottom here to get that mini-nuke style look. So let's go ahead and create that. We'll go ahead and go to our chaos tab here. We'll deselect the dynamic smoke fire, and then we'll select the dynamic smoke instead, since we just want smoke to be blasted along the ground here. And then again, we'll go to frame 20, and we'll select our 360 ground burst operator. Instead of scaling this one up on the z-axis, we will scale this one down on the z-axis to create a flat 360 ground burst, and we'll put this down right at the floor here. As you can see, that blasts along the floor, which is pretty cool. We also need to increase the amount of particles here as well. Under our particle tab, for the dust wave particles, we'll increase the number to something like, we'll try like 780. And now we have something like that. Now that's going to look pretty good. I want to shorten the amount of time that these particles are emitted, so I'm going to change the end frame of the particles to 24, and that's looking pretty cool. This is looking pretty cool. There are a lot of things you can tweak, but let's go ahead and create our third 360 ground burst. So as you can see, when we scroll through the simulation, one thing I notice is that sometimes there gets to be some empty space in between our two operators here, so we want to kind of fill this in so there's not kind of a lack of smoke in this area. So let's go ahead and go to our chaos tab. We'll deselect the dynamic smoke button. Again, we'll select the dynamic smoke fire, and we will go to frame 20 once again, and we will press on the 360 ground burst operator, and we want to just bring it up here. We'll kind of scale it down, and we want this one to kind of fill in the gaps in between the two particle systems we've added already, but we want to do that in a way that doesn't really affect the general look of the explosion. We just want to fill in that area with some smoke. So to do that, we'll actually go to our particle settings here, and we'll change the lifetime of this specific particle system to something like 2. And now, as you can see, what that's doing is just filling in this space right here. Let's see if we can we just want it to kind of fill in that space in between the two particle systems. Of course, you can tweak a lot of this stuff, but this is looking pretty cool for a mini-nuke style blast. I'm going to change the end frame of this actually as well to 24. Alright, that's looking pretty cool. Let's go ahead and simulate our first version of our explosion. Before we do that, we're going to add some lights to our scene. So let's go ahead and press Shift A, and we'll go to add a sun, position it pointing at our object here, and we'll just duplicate that. We'll go press Shift D, duplicate, and put this one over here, rotate it around. Alright, so this is pretty rudimentary, but you get the idea. Got to get some light on your smoke to give it some detail. Let's go ahead and go to our smoke domain here. Let's make sure it's big enough. I think right now it's a little bit small. We might have some issues with the smoke on its boundaries, so let's go ahead and scale it up a little bit. Something like that. And we'll press this up, grab it, and get it to be right there. Okay, now we will go to our smoke domain. So we'll go to the physics properties, and under our fluid settings, this is the main difference between Mantaflow and the older L-beam smoke simulator. So this is where we change the environment in which our smoke interacts in. As I've said before, a lot of things are very similar. The resolution divisions controls both the detail of your smoke, but also the higher this number is, the more large scale your smoke is going to look. We have it at 128 for default, which can be pretty cool, but since this tutorial is for a larger scale smoke simulation, we're going to increase this to 256. Under the border collisions options here, we want our smoke to interact with the bottom of the smoke domain. And then we have our smoke settings very neutral right now, but you can also play around with these if you want. Under the fire settings, we want to adjust the reaction speed of the smoke because we want the flames of our simulation to burn off a little more slowly. 0.75 can give some pretty cool results, but again, we want that kind of fiery gasoline look, so I'm going to go ahead and change this to 0.05. And that'll give us a much more slower burning fuel. And I'll go ahead and select adaptive domain. This will speed up our bake. And yeah, that's pretty much it. We'll change the end frame of our bake to something like 150. So it's going to bake our simulation from frame 1 to 150. And I think that's it. Yes. And yeah, so let's just double check our particles here really quick. 780. But we should probably increase the amount of our last particle field. Right now we only have 100 particles, so let's increase that to 750. That's just that's for the one that's emitting particles kind of in between the other two. Okay, so now we have these particle systems for fuel set up. Now let's go ahead and bake our simulation. So to do that, we will select our smoke domain once again, and we will go to our physics properties tab here under our fluid settings. And we need to go to the bake data option here. I recommend saving your project first. So let's go File, Save As. And we'll call this Mantaflow tutorial for YouTube, just in case our computer crashes. All right, so now that we've saved our project, let's go ahead and start our simulation by pressing Bake Data. Depending on the hardware in your computer, this process could take anywhere between 30 minutes to 2 hours. I'm running a 2017 MacBook Pro. It usually takes me about an hour to bake this kind of simulation at 256 grid resolution. But of course, it also depends on what's running in the background. But this is a good time to take a break and come back to see your explosion simulation a bit later. Alright, so we are back and we have a pretty awesome looking explosion simulation here already. One of the best ways you can preview the look of your simulation is through the OpenGL Render Active Viewport option here. So to render out a preview of your animation and then view it back in real time, you would just go to View and Viewport Render Animation. When you do this, Blender is going to go through and make an animation of your scene in preview mode, as you can see here. And then to play back that animation, you'll just go to Render and View Animation. And as you can see, we can play back our explosion here in real time. And this is one of the best ways you can get an idea of how your explosion can look without actually rendering out all your frames with the correct lighting and materials. So this is looking pretty freaking awesome. We have a nice mushroom cloud, and the fire is behaving very much like we want it to with that slow burn effect. Now that we know that we like the behavior of the smoke mesh, we can bake it with higher resolution. So as you can see here, if we go to rendered view, we get a cool looking blast. Obviously we need to play around with the materials to get the detail to show up a lot more, but even if we play with those materials and we get the brightness of our simulation down a little bit to get a little bit more of a fiery look, it's still a fairly low resolution look. As you can see, once you zoom into the smoke, there's not a lot of detail. The best way to get those smaller details is to use the noise factor in Mantaflow. So we're going to go ahead and select our smoke domain here. Then we'll go to the physics properties here again, and then as you can see, if you go under noise here and select this, then we can actually up-res our original simulation with smaller scale detail. And there are a few options you can choose here. You can change the noise method, you can change the strength of the noise, you can change the scale of the noise, and you can change the time, essentially the animation of the noise. This does require some experimentation, but the main thing you need to worry about for more detail is this up-res factor here. This number is going to determine how much more small scale detail you want added to your smoke simulation. So the higher this number is, it's going to scale your resolution by that factor. So for this specific example, I'm going to increase this to 3, and then when we bake this, it's going to increase the resolution of that base mesh by 3. And that should be pretty good. Obviously, the higher this up-res factor is, the more detail you're going to have, but also that's at the cost of more time. So if your explosion is off in the distance, maybe you don't need this at all. If your explosion is very smoke, you probably want to crank this up quite a bit and experiment with some of the strength and scale settings. Anyways, guys, let's go ahead and save our project one more time, and then we'll go ahead and bake the noise on our original smoke mesh. Alright guys, so we are back and we have baked our high resolution noise onto our original simulation. It's looking pretty awesome, so now I'm just going to show you how to adjust the materials in your simulation and export it with an alpha channel. Let's go ahead and select our domain cube, and then we'll go to a part of the explosion with a little bit of fire in our smoke, so we'll maybe frame 30. Okay, maybe a little bit after that, maybe frame 40. And as you can see, there's some pretty nice small scale detail in our fire here, which is going to give some pretty awesome results once we get into dialing in the material. So let's go ahead and make sure you have your domain selected, and then we will go to the shading tab here. Right now this is showing us Eevee, so we want to switch to the cycles rendering option up here on the right. And as you can see, it's a little bit bright right now, so we're going to change our settings in our node setup down here. Alright, so the node setup we have for the smoke and fire is similar to the old version of Chaos, but we have made some minor adjustments. At the top here we have the value of the density, so the higher this is, the more dense the smoke will be and the more it will hide the fire. This middle color ramp changes the color of the flames throughout different areas of it. So we have the deep dark parts of the flame, the yellow parts of the flame, and then the hottest part of the flame, which will be white. And you can adjust these or add more colors onto this color ramp. Finally, at the bottom here we have this multiply node, which will change the amount of brightness in our flames. And we can also adjust the contrast of this brightness, in other words, the difference in the brightest and the darkest parts of the flame. And then we also have the contrast node for the density, which when we increase this will create a more thick smoke along with the density value here. We also have the second color ramp here, which controls how much the smoke surrounds the flames. So if we move this point over to the right, as you can see, the smoke starts surrounding the flames a little bit more along the edges. Alright, so first, since our flames are way too bright right now, we are going to decrease the amount of brightness in our flames, so we'll change this value to something like 300. And now it's looking much better. We might decrease a little bit more, maybe something like 100. And now as you can see, it's looking pretty good already. We might decrease the density since our dust wave is looking pretty dense here. So we'll just go up to our density node here and we'll just change this to something like 220. This is kind of just a matter of experimentation to see what you like. We'll try 100. And then we'll put the contrast at 1 to give a little more thick look. And then we'll also decrease our brightness once again. Put this at, say, 60. Maybe even less. We might even put it at something like 55. Alright, this is looking pretty cool. A lot of your fiery result is going to come in your compositing processes, but what we want to make sure we have here is a detailed fluid here, so we have some dark points and we have some lighter points as well. So we can also adjust our flame setting here, give it a little more variation. But this is looking pretty awesome, guys. I think I'm pretty happy with this result. Feel free to experiment with it some more. You can also go to different parts of the simulation. So if we go a few more frames in, and now as you can see, our flames are dissipating a bit more. I might actually change our color ramp here a little bit and hide our flames a little bit more. I might actually boost the contrast of our flames a little bit, maybe put this at 2. There are a lot of different things you can play around with, maybe 1. And this is looking pretty awesome. We have some dark spots of the flame as the fuel burns off, and I think this will look pretty cool for a distant explosion. Once we add some glow and glare and compositing, it's going to look really nice. Now let's go ahead and prepare our explosion for exporting with an alpha channel. So let's go back to our layout tab here. First, let's go ahead and add a camera. And we'll just put this camera back here a bit. We'll view through it. Just kind of position this to get the whole explosion. Alright, this is a pretty nice frame here. Let's make sure that it's working for the end of our animation as well. We have a pretty nice looking full explosion here. Now let me show you a few settings you need to tweak before you do your renders. We'll go to the camera tab here. Make sure you're on cycles. I usually render smoke between 40 and 60 samples, so I'll put it at 40 for now. I always check my seed stopwatch under the advanced settings here for some noise variation. Then under light paths, we want to increase the volume bounces to at least 4, so we have some more light bouncing around our smoke. Under volumes, I recommend decreasing your step size to 0.05 and putting your max steps at 260. Finally, I'm going to render this with an alpha channel, so I'll go to the film tab here and I'll click the transparent option, and that's pretty much it. For our render properties, under the output tab here, we will render at 1920 by 1080p resolution. We will boost the resolution to 100. Then under output, we will change our file format to the OpenEXR file sequence. And of course, you can choose your output folder here.
And finally, we want to render this explosion with shadows under it. So if we would like, we can composite it into an animation or a live action shot. So let's go ahead and take our ground plane here. We'll go ahead and scale it up along the Z-axis. We'll also scale it up along the Y-axis. And now while this is selected, let's go to its object properties here, and we'll go to the visibility here, and we'll go ahead and check the shadow catcher box. And by doing that, our plane below our smoke will only render the shadows on it based on the other objects around it. Now let's go ahead and make this a better material for our scene. Say we want to put this in the desert, we would want to change our material of our ground plane to something like a basic diffuse material probably. So we'll just go to diffuse, and we'll just make it a darker color. And since this is only going to render our shadows, it doesn't have to be a specific material, but we do want the light bouncing off of it not to affect our smoke too much, so we'll make it a darker layer here. Alright, anyways guys, to render your simulation, you would first of course save your project to make sure your computer doesn't crash. Make sure that the frames you want rendered are here at the bottom. So for example, we're going to render from frame 1 to frame 125, and then you would just go ahead and press render and render animation, and then give some time for your computer to render out all of your frames. Anyways guys, that's it for this video. I hope it was helpful. It's pretty awesome working with Mantaflow and the Chaos add-on, so I hope you enjoy it. As always, feel free to leave any comments if you have any questions or suggestions in the comment section below. Let me know what you want to see next. Let me know what tutorials you would like to see in using Chaos with Mantaflow, and I'll see you guys next time.